Making these phone calls despite the hate and opposition you're facing, because you know it's such important work for the state of Vermont, is a really respectable thing. Our targeting system was pretty precise, so when we started off we were contacting a much larger pool of people, just identifying people who were definite supporters, definite opposition, or undecided voters. That was the identification phase. We then moved into persuasion, where we were just going back through and contacting undecided voters, trying to persuade them and tell them why they should vote for Peter Shumlin. Then towards the end, during Get Out the Vote, which is by far the most important stage of any Democratic Party's campaign, we were just focusing on contacting our identified supporters, reminding them to get to the polls and vote. That's really the real legwork of any campaign, because Democrats in particular have very low voter turnout rates. Rich Republicans can get out and vote every year to protect their money, but disenfranchised Democrats that work 2 jobs a day simply don't have time, and voting often gets put on the back burner. So luckily, as time went on, the amount of hate and opposition we encountered on the phones diminished, because of, our targeting system was allowing us to contact people who were just undecided voters, not necessarily blind opposition. And at the end, we were just calling through and talking to our supporters, so those were a lot easier phone calls to make. In the same regards, this time of year during an election cycle, people get a lot of phone calls. So even people who are definite supporters were understandably perhaps getting a little upset, just because there are national agencies calling, we're calling, the Republicans are calling. So towards the end, there were a lot of sometimes very angry people on the phones, and like I said before, I really respect all the hard work that my volunteers put in shrugging off some of the hateful things that were said in order to continue this really important work. There was a lot of, especially for us Shumlin supporters in the primary, election night was a difficult night for us, because in the primary we had all this energy going into election night in the primary, and then as the night progressed on and we just kept seeing how close of a race it was, and how we weren't going to have a decisive, we weren't going to have a candidate, and how essentially, every time the numbers flashed up on the TV screen, it was 25%, 25%, 25% for Peter, Doug, and Deb. In a lot of ways, election night was very similar to that, in that, throughout the whole campaign, I think as, staff as a whole, we were confident we were going to win this election, but by how much was what we weren't sure of. If either candidate gets under 50%, the decision goes to the legislature, and then or the possibility, if one candidate doesn't concede, the decision can go to the legislature, and in that case we wouldn't have a governor elected until January. So that was something that we were all really nervous about going into election night. As the night progressed on, we of course knew Peter was going to come on. We were all gathered at the Hilton for a reception party, and we knew that Peter would come out and give the "we're not going to have a winner tonight" speech, which he did. We had all known, at that point we knew we had won. We had called around to, the numbers we had gathered and the numbers we were seeing in the media reflected that we were confident we had won. Whether or not we had won by a large enough margin to secure a definite win, or whether or not Brian Doobie would concede graciously, which he did, were 2 entirely different stories. So there was a lot of energy that night, and a lot of apprehension as well. Overall, I do feel this was a very successful year for Democrats in Vermont. Nationwide we lost about 60 House seats. Here in Vermont we broke even. We didn't lose a single House seat. I believe we only lost 1 state Senate seat. Both our national Senate and national Congressmen, Peter Welch and Pat Leahy, were both re-elected, and additionally we have a Democratic governor. In a lot of ways, this election was really important to my current work. I work as a direct support worker for clients with developmental disabilities through the Howard Center. which is the largest service agency in the state. You know, under the Douglas administration, earlier in our last financial year, our last financial term, we were facing 25% budget cuts, which means for a lot of the consumers and the clients we support, means major drawbacks in the supports that assist them in their day-to-day lives. Our lobbyists were able to bring it down to about a 1% cut. However, under the what would have been the Brian Doobie administration, had he won, services for seniors, services for youth, and services for vulnerable populations as a whole would be the first areas in which we would have budget cutbacks. So essentially my job was directly affected by whether or not Peter Shumlin won this campaign. The way campaigns work is it is a temporary position. Literally, your last day of work is November 2nd. There were some additional work days. We had to wrap up, clean up the offices, things like that. But there's no guaranteed position after the campaign. However, I feel like the experience that I got in working on this campaign is just as valuable as an actual job promise. Now this in a lot of ways was my foot in the door of politics. The work I do now I think is really important. It's been a great opportunity to directly influence. It's been a great opportunity to do some really important work helping the lives of the two clients that I support, but it's not what I want to do with my life. I went to school to study politics. I want to be involved.